Before we dive into the esoteric depths today, just a quick reminder to make sure you're following the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening on right now. Hitting that follow button and leaving a review really is the best way to support the show. And if you want to keep the conversation going throughout the week, come find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Cogito Ergo Pod. We post bite-sized philosophy, behind-the-scenes content, and episode updates over there, and I absolutely love interacting with you all in the comments. Last time out, we journeyed into the dizzying, dramatic cosmology of Sethian Gnosticism. We talked about the divine pleroma, the tragic fall of Sophia, and the creation of the material world by a malevolent, ignorant demiurge named Yaldabaoth. It was a theology of cosmic rebellion, a deeply mythological and almost sci-fi narrative where the material world is a prison and spiritual awakening is the ultimate prison break. But the Gnostic movement was not a monolith. It was a vibrant, chaotic ecosystem of early Christian thought. So today, we are going to look at a completely different branch of the Gnostic tree. Hello, and welcome to Cogito Ergo Pod, the show where we discuss, delve, and dissect theology, philosophy, mysticism, and the esoteric. I'm your host, Daniel. We are moving away from the mystic drama of the Sethians and entering the highly intellectual, deeply philosophical, and arguably much more abstract world of Basilidian Gnosticism. To understand this school of thought, we have to travel to Alexandria, Egypt, in the early 2nd century, roughly between 117 and 138 CE. During the reigns of the Roman emperors Trajan and Hadrian, Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, a melting pot where Greek philosophy, Judaism, Egyptian mysticism, and the newly emerging Christian faith all collided and cross-pollinated. It was here that a Christian teacher named Basilides began to preach. Basilides wasn't just a rogue philosopher. He claimed a direct, authoritative lineage. He asserted that his teachings were passed down to him by a man named Glaucus, who was reportedly the interpreter of the Apostle Peter. Other sources suggest Basilides claimed to possess secret traditions handed down from the Apostle Matthias. Working alongside his son and chief disciple, Isidore, Basilides wrote an extensive 24-volume commentary on the Gospels, known as the Exegeta. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant, charismatic, and highly educated thinker. So what did Basilides and his followers actually believe? And how did it differ from the Sethians or the Valentinians we discussed previously? Well, if Sethianism reads like a cosmic tragic epic, Basilidianism reads like a high-concept Greek philosophy. The Sethians believed in a pre-existing divine realm that accidentally spilled into the material world. Basilides, however, took a totally different approach. He started with absolute nothingness. According to the account preserved by the early Christian writer Hippolytus, Basilides taught the concept of the non-existent God, or as it is sometimes translated, the God who is not. This isn't atheism. It is radical transcendence. God is so far beyond human comprehension, so entirely other, that to even say God exists is to limit him. God is beyond existence itself. This non-existent God didn't create the universe through a fall or an emanation, but by speaking a single seed, a cosmic blueprint containing all the DNA of the universe, both spiritual and material. It's an ancient, mystical version of the Big Bang, mixed with the concept of panspermia. From this cosmic seed, different levels of reality began to unfold. And here is where we meet the archons, the rulers of the lower heavens. The great archon, sometimes identified as Abraxas or Abrasax, rules over 365 heavens. But notice here the distinction between other forms of Gnosticism we've discussed. For example, in Sethianism, the creator god, Yaldabaoth, is evil, arrogant, and oppressive, while the creator god in Valentinianism is naive and somewhat ignorant. In Basilidianism, the great archon is ignorant, but not inherently malevolent. He thinks he is the supreme god because he can't see the realms above him. But when the gospel, the divine light of Jesus, descends through the heavens to awaken the spiritual seeds trapped in humanity, the great archon learns about the non-existent God. And what does he do? He doesn't fight it, he repents, he rejoices. Basilides interpreted the biblical proverb, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," as the exact moment the great archon realized he is not the top of the cosmic hierarchy. It's a remarkably optimistic view compared to other Gnostic sects. The ultimate goal in Basilidianism isn't just escaping the body, but the restoration of all things, and this involves a concept known as the Great Ignorance. Basilides taught that at the end of time, once all the spiritual souls had ascended back to the divine realm, God will cast a blanket of blissful ignorance over the lower realms. The beings left in the material and psychic realms will simply forget that anything higher exists, meaning they won't suffer from the pain of longing for a heaven they cannot reach. It is a profoundly merciful, if strange, eschatology. Now, if you're thinking, wow, this sounds like a deeply intricate, somewhat beautiful philosophical system, you aren't wrong, but not everyone saw it that way. In fact, most of what we know about Basilides comes from the people who hated him, and if anything we've learned so far looking at Gnosticism, it wasn't unusual for the haters to be the source of much of our information. Because Basilides' texts were systematically destroyed and lost to time, we have to rely on the heresiologists, the early Orthodox Church Fathers who wrote massive volumes attacking him. And this is where the academic puzzle gets tricky, because they couldn't even agree on what Basilides actually taught. We've already mentioned Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the early 3rd century CE, who gave us the philosophical non-existent God narrative. But a few decades earlier, our old friend Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most famous early heresy hunters, wrote about Basilides in his seminal work Adversus Heresis, against heresies. Irenaeus paints a much darker, more magical picture of the Basilidians. He accused them of practicing magic, using secret passwords to bypass angels, and teaching a radical form of docetism regarding the crucifixion. According to Irenaeus, Basilides taught that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Instead, Jesus swapped bodies with Simon of Cyrene, the man forced to carry the cross. Simon was crucified by mistake, while Jesus stood by, invisible, laughing at the Romans before ascending to heaven. Then we have Clement of Alexandria, who lived in the same city Basilides had lived in, writing about 200 CE. Clement actually quotes fragments of Basilides' son, Isidore. Clement paints them as strict moralists, deeply concerned with the problem of evil, suffering, and faith. So, who was right? Hippolytus, Irenaeus, or Clement? Modern scholars believe they might all be dealing with different phases of the Basilidian movement. The religion likely evolved, as religions do. What started as the high-minded philosophy of Basilides and Isidore, which Clement and Hippolytus documented, may have devolved over the centuries into a more popular, magical, and superstitious cult, which Irenaeus and later writers like Epiphanius attacked. Ultimately, Basilidianism was suppressed, but it wasn't wiped out overnight by sword and fire. In these early centuries, suppression was an institutional and intellectual boxing out. As the Proto-Orthodox Church began to solidify its power, it did so by drawing hard boundaries. They established the canon of the New Testament. They formulated creeds, and they formalized the apostolic succession of bishops. If your theology didn't fit the creed, you were excommunicated. Basilidian texts were banned from being read in church. Their leaders were marginalized, and they simply couldn't compete with the highly organized, structurally unified Orthodox Church. By the time the heresy hunter Epiphanius was writing in the late 4th century, Basilidianism was practically a ghost, surviving only in small, isolated pockets in Egypt before vanishing entirely. Basilidianism remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of early Christianity. It was an attempt to wed the teachings of Jesus with the absolute heights of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy. It gave us a God beyond being, a cosmic seed, an ignorant but repentant demiurge, and a merciful apocalypse of forgetfulness. It serves as a stunning reminder of just how wild, diverse, and fiercely creative the first few centuries of Christian mysticism truly were. Thank you so much for joining me today on this journey into the mind of Basilides. Please don't forget to follow the show on your podcast platform of choice and leave a rating or review. It is the #1 way to help us appease the algorithmic archons. And be sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at Cogito Ergo Pod to keep the esoteric discussions going all week long. This has been Cogito Ergo Pod, and remember, keep questioning, keep seeking, and stay curious. Speak to you again soon.